So, what Darwin and Wallace both taught us are the basic kind of processes by which evolution occurs. The first factor is that all species are capable of producing offspring at a faster rate than the food supply can increase. And so we see this throughout, both modern contexts and historical ones. We refer to this in biology as the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is the number or the population level beyond which the environment can't sustain. And we see predictable like baby booms followed by population crashes. There's a great population cycle that's documented in southern Canada between rabbits and lynx. Lynx are wild cats. And in this context, when there's a very humid, moist year with a lot of rainfall, the grass grows everywhere. When grass grows, rabbits grow everywhere. They reproduce at a really high rate because there's a lot to feed on. When rabbits reproduce at really high rates, then there's a lot for lynx to feed their babies. And so then following the rabbit boom comes a lynx boom. Well, when the lynx population increases, the rabbit population crashes. That crash in the rabbit population can also occur in a dry year when there's not as much grass. The idea that there's not enough food to support that large population of rabbits. Excuse me, pardon me. When the rabbit population crashes, the lynx population, kind of offset in time, will also crash. And so we see this cyclicity in population numbers where the lynx are displaced by a period of time from those rabbit cycles because they're responding then to kind of the after effects of the rabbit baby boom. The second basic tenet is that there is biological variation within all species. This variation doesn't need to have an adaptive function. There simply is variation, right? I mean, look around the community that you find yourself in. People are of all different shapes and sizes. Now, sometimes body shape, body size can be associated with, let's say, fitness in the sense of health. I mean, if you have a genetic trait of dwarfism, you also oftentimes have other problems such as cardiovascular problems, problems with the development of your heart, skeletal problems, etc. So having extremely short stature, at least in the sense of the mutations that give rise to dwarfism, can be associated with negative health outcomes. Similarly, really, really, really tall people, when you look at like the Guinness Book of World Records holder, the people who are like pushing 8 feet tall, they also have cardiovascular problems. Their heart can't effectively deliver blood to extremities that are so far away. So they often die at really young ages as well. So most of the variation that we see in height is functionally neutral, at least in a modern context. It doesn't really make a difference in a modern context whether you're 5'4" or 5'8". You're going to have enough to eat. You're going to be able to survive. You're going to be able to find a job. You're going to be able to find a mate, so on and so forth. So that is just natural variation that occurs within populations. In each generation, more offspring are produced than can survive. You couple this with limited resources, this creates the venue for competition. So as an individual reproducer, I am going to do whatever I can to give my offspring kind of that competitive edge, to give them a higher likelihood of survival. We are going to have outright intentional competition. I mean, it's not just going to be a matter of you forage at a higher efficiency than I do, therefore I die, right? We are going to have contest competition where we fight over access to resources and access to mates. We're going to have mortality that occurs not only from simply not having enough food, but mortality that occurs from this contest competition. So this venue of competition cannot be minimized. I mean, it's a very critical component of evolution by natural selection. Individuals that have favorable traits have an advantage over those who don't, and are more likely to survive and reproduce, and thus have higher biological fitness. In this context, though, with this next point, what's beneficial, what's favorable, what's not, is determined by the environment, not determined by some preconceived notion of what should do better. So, we can think of contexts where being fast, it pays off. I mean, for a lot of prey species, right? Think about jackrabbits. If you're fast, you're going to avoid being caught. You're going to survive for longer and be able to reproduce. Um, Now, that then leads to um, ever increasing selection pressures favoring the development of speed among species like jackrabbits. Now, let's take a look at a sloth. Does a sloth avoid being predated upon by being fast? No, I mean, sloths are so slow that algae grows in their fur. So, for a sloth, being fast is going to come with a metabolic burden. They're not going to be able to eat enough greenery to be able to support the higher metabolism that's necessary for producing bursts of speed. So, for a sloth, the way that you avoid being eaten is by having algae growing in your fur and effectively blending into the forest canopy. You're hiding. Being fast is going to impede your ability to hide. So, this idea of traits being favorable, it's the environment that dictates what's successful in that particular given environment. Those can vary across environments so that even closely related species may have very different expression of what we call phenotypic traits. Traits are inherited and passed on to the next generation. The more favorable traits are disproportionately present in successive generations. So, if you possess a variant that leads to greater survival and greater reproductive success than I do, you are going to have more babies that are going to be present in the next generation. If your babies inherit that trait, then they are going to survive and reproduce at higher numbers, which means that the next generation is going to have even more genetic copies of those traits that in those individuals that were successful. So over time, what might only be a small advantage, let's say a 0.1 percent advantage in terms of total population numbers, over an extended period of time, that can lead to trait fixation. That can lead to a trait being like 99% present in a population. So that it's really this differential reproduction, and I mean survival up to the point that survival affects reproduction, that leads to changing patterns, changing gene frequencies, changing expression of traits within a population. Over long periods of time, these successful variations can accumulate to the point that populations can become distinct, even becoming new species. Geographical isolation contributes to speciation. So what does all this mean? Well, this means that different environments favor different variation. They favor different expressions of traits. And that given enough time, very small differences can become magnified to the point that two populations become separate species. There's one example of this that's a pretty good illustration. Um, there are types of shrimp in kind of the Caribbean known as snapping shrimp. And they are called snapping shrimp because they have one front pincher that it looks kind of like a fiddler crab. If you've seen fiddler crabs, you know that they've got one claw that's larger, that's more elaborated than the others, and that's their quote unquote fiddler, right? And so in these snapping shrimp, they have one claw that's dramatically larger. Interestingly, prior to about 3 million years ago, North and South America were separated by permanent water. The Isthmus of Panama was not present. That only occurred about 3 million years ago. In the 3 million years since the Isthmus of Panama arose, the populations of snapping shrimp on the Atlantic and the Pacific side have diverged to the point they are now considered separate species. On one side of the isthmus, they're right-handed, meaning that their front right pincher is the one that's elaborated. On the other side, they're left-handed, meaning that it's their front left claw that's that much bigger. So there's no functional difference in whether they're right-handed or left-handed. Right-handed shrimp don't do better than left-handed shrimp. What matters is that they have one larger claw to defend against predation and to be able to fight with conspecifics. And so that claw can be, either left or right. But now that enough time has passed and they haven't been able to interbreed, they've developed other mechanisms that would prevent interbreeding if they ever did come into contact again. So what started as a simple effect of what we would call a founder effect of just more right-handed shrimp on one side than left-handed has led now to a critical kind of marker of those species differences. As we think about natural selection and we think about evolution, we've got to recognize that natural selection occurs at the individual level. So, the population expresses variation, but it's individuals who express one variant or the other. So here we see variation in the colored wings of butterflies. The variation leads to red wings, brown wings, and almost kind of greenish wings. All of the butterflies overproduce. The red wings have too many babies, the green wings have too many babies, the brown wings have too many babies. The population cannot support this overproduction of offspring. Then it's the environment that dictates which variation is favorable. In this context, the environment is characterized by trees. Trees have brown trunks, trees have green leaves, therefore butterflies that are brown or green can blend in and evade predation. Red-winged butterflies can't. Over time, at the population level, we see evolutionary change. Evolution's measured at this population level. Over time, we see the gene frequencies shift from equal likelihood of red, green, and brown to a very small proportion of brown wings and a much larger proportion of both green or a very small proportion of red wings and a much larger proportion of both brown and green. So the environment or the kind of selective agent here that is operating through natural selection, or is that agent of change, is predation and kind of what's available to blend in with. If in that bottom left quadrant where we have different survival rates, if instead of being a field of trees, it were a field of red poppies or some other brilliant red flower, then green wings and red wings might blend in more, and the brown wings would have been selected against. So the environment, which kind of mediates natural selection, picks among individuals. If you have a favored variant, you survive. If you don't have a favored variant, you don't. But over time, we measure evolutionary change through the gene frequencies that are present at the population level, not through one individual's genome or expression of traits. And so we see a variety of even modern examples of natural selection in action. Natural selection that could, given enough time, lead to speciation events. These first two pictures represent the peppered moth. The peppered moth was native to the British Isles. It naturally has two variants. It has a melanistic variant, which is black in color, and it has its peppered or speckled variant, which is gray with spots. That gray with spots is very similar to what trees looked like prior to the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, trees were covered with lichens, which is a symbiotic relationship between algae and moss. And over time, these trees became kind of grayish, spotted with some green, so that when birds were soaring through the forest trying to decide which moths to eat, they could see the melanistic variants. That's what's present in this picture right here. This bird is taking a melanistic variant, not one of the lighter colors. With the Industrial Revolution, we see an increase in coal fire, both in households and in factories. And what this does is leads to a deposition of soot on the trunks of trees. It is the soot deposition that changes kind of the payoff to being different colors. And with soot on trees, suddenly the birds can't see the melanistic variants. The black ones blend in, and it's the speckled ones or the peppered variant that birds can see. Therefore, we see a very abrupt shift, both historically and even in modern times with cleanup measures and such. We can see really big population shifts in a very short period of time as mediated through changing environmental conditions. So here The agent of selection is bird predation. The environmental condition is the color of the tree trunk. When that color is lichen colored, is light, then you're going to have more speckled moths, more peppered variants than you are melanistic variants. When the color is dark because of pollution, you are going to have more melanistic moths than you are peppered moths. Similarly, there's been an effect on what's called the medium ground finch from the Galapagos Islands. There was a drought in the 1980s that led to very, very different kinds of seeds that were present for the ground finches on several Galapagos Islands. And so in drought conditions, the seeds that are produced are often very thick-shelled. They're larger in size. When conditions are more wet, flowers will do a very quick kind of burst of seed production where their seeds have thinner husks and are smaller in size. What happened during this drought cycle was that all of the ground finches, the medium ground finches who were smaller in size and had smaller beaks, they all died. They starved to death, leaving only larger bodied, larger beaked ground finches. If there had been enough time, if conditions hadn't changed, if those drought conditions had persisted for successive generations, we could have seen a population shift that could lead to speciation. This was an example in the 1980s of us being able to witness the process that led to the differences in Darwin's finch beaks. Back in the 1800s. So really exciting to be able to see that snapshot, that moment of evolution in process. Instead, there was a shift then back to wet years that then increased the favorability of smaller body size, smaller beaks, which led to an overabundance then of the smaller body size and smaller beak shapes. What this bottom picture represents is MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Through our use of things like antibacterial and antibiotic products, we are favoring very rapid evolution in pathogens. We are creating situations like antibiotic resistance. We are creating superbugs merely through our cultural practices. And so MRSA represents one of these. It's resistant to every antibiotic that we can throw its way. MRSA is also known as the flesh-eating bacteria. You are most likely to pick up MRSA in a hospital setting. If you have MRSA, you will probably never get rid of it. It will remain latent in your body, and you can have flare-ups really at any time based on kind of your stress levels and such. Kind of like herpes can do to people as well, where it stays in your system and stress can lead to flare-ups. So, we are we are the environment in which rapid evolutionary change is happening to pathogens. And, we're probably overdue for a global pandemic. It's not really a happy thought, but probably within our lifetime, we will see 1/3 to 2/3 of the world's population killed off by some sort of infection. We'd like to think, or maybe, kind of pop culture would make us think it's going to be something really virulent, like Ebola. It's not. It's not going to be Ebola because Ebola kills too well. Ebola as a virus has like a 70 to 90% killing likelihood, which means that nobody survives Ebola. So it would totally, if you wipe out your host entirely, you're not very successful as a pathogen. So it's probably going to be something related to tuberculosis or influenza. We're already seeing drug-resistant forms of tuberculosis. Even in New Mexico, we've got some forms of TB that there are no drugs to treat them. We also we talk about it every single year, that each year is going to be the really bad flu year where the vaccine's not going to be effective and we're going to have massive die-offs. And now whether those predictions bear to fruition or not, the effect is the same. We're seeing very rapid evolution of pathogens because of our cultural features, because of our use of medicines, because of our sterilizing our environment, so on and so forth. All right, so Darwin is the name that is most oft associated with evolution by natural selection. We neat to recognize this difference. We talked about it, of course, in Module 1, this difference between law and theory. In the behavioral and biological sciences, laws aren't like really all that common. We don't see these invariant processes like we see within physics, like things such as gravity and such. And so in behavioral and biological sciences, it is theory that's driving everything. And so Darwin is most often associated with evolutionary theory. When we vilify evolutionary theory, we vilify Darwin. There's a lot Darwin didn't know. There's a lot of stuff that's been discovered that has expanded evolutionary theory. It's what we call the new synthesis or neo-Darwinian thinking that has come since, I mean, well after Darwin's death. Really, the last 20 years or so have been incredibly exciting in opening up new explanations for evolutionary change. One of the things that Darwin didn't know about was the method of heritability or inheritance. Gregor Mendel was doing his work at about the same time, but Gregor Mendel's work stayed covered until the early 20th century. So Darwin was not privy to Gregor Mendel's work with pea plants. What Mendel did was identified discrete units or particles that we now call genes that were on discrete units or particles that we call chromosomes that were these units of heritability. And so Mendel gave us the idea of dominant and recessive forms, gave us the idea of independent assortment and the laws of segregation, independent segregation. So Gregor Mendel was the father of kind of modern genetics. Now, of course, Mendelian genetics is overly simplified. We don't often find very many things that are one gene, one trait, and particularly when we're talking about humans, things are incredibly more complex. So there's been a lot of work done in the past 50 years or so with respect to genetics as well. I mean, we've sequenced the entire human genome. We've sequenced the Neanderthal genome. We have identified a slew of genes that are associated with a slew of particularly medical conditions, the BRCA1 and 2 genes associated with an increased risk of breast cancer, etc. We're still not any closer to understanding everything there is about to understand about inheritance and heritability, and that's where the second bullet point comes in: the interaction between the environment and gene expression, also called evo-devo or evolutionary theory and developmental biology. Evolutionary, it's kind of the synthesis of evolutionary biology and developmental biology. What evo-devo tells us is that we cannot disentangle the effects of nature versus nurture. We cannot separate out what is merely an effect of our DNA versus an effect of our environment, because our environment during our development sets the timetable for gene expression. We can have a different environment during different stages of development that can dramatically change the outcome. For example, crocodiles can change the sex of their offspring by adding or removing sand from the nest, thereby mediating temperature. Temperature can determine sex in a reptile, which, I mean, that should be blowing your mind, right? I mean, that's pretty phenomenal that something as small maybe as temperature can have such a dramatic effect. So this field of evo-devo is giving us a whole lot of insight. For example, one of the environments that dramatically affects gene expression in humans is the intrauterine environment. The problem is it's not always your mother's uterine environment when she's pregnant with you. That intrauterine environment extends back to your grandmother's uterine environment when she was pregnant with your mother, because your genetic material was laid down in an egg in your mother's ovaries when your mother was developing in your grandmother's womb. And so we can have generational carryover of things like trauma. For example, there are genetic markers that we see among the descendants of Holocaust survivors. So there is such a thing as intergenerational trauma that can leave a mark on your genetic code. So, I mean, evo-devo is a burgeoning field. There's a whole lot of research being done there. It is mind-boggling what we're finding out with some of these newer findings. So, Darwin thought that the environment came in at that kind of endpoint. Do you survive long enough to reproduce? And if you do, how well do you reproduce? That's where the environment was active. When in reality, the environment is not only active there, but also active throughout our entire course of development. And so a lot of the traits that we have may not even be heritable per se, but developmental in nature through an environmental kind of trigger or signal. The wealth of the hominin fossil record. Darwin didn't have very many hominin fossils. It was really been since like the 1980s on that we keep uncovering more and more fossil hominins. Pardon me. And every time we have a new finding, we potentially have to redraw our evolutionary family tree. Now, later in the term, I'm going to talk about the fact that it's not an evolutionary family tree. It's more like a blackberry bramble, in that it's a tangled, jumbled mess with no clear trunk coming out of the ground, much like many bushes. But, regardless of that, I mean, we have the potential with each and every new fossil find to radically redefine kind of how we put together the picture of humanity. One of the criticisms, of course, of evolution is that, well, we haven't found the missing link. No, we've only found like 20 some different missing links, all that fit together in some unique and novel way. And we're not even probably halfway there yet. So your textbook mentions that the only way that we're going to stop the controversy between evolution and creationism is going to be when we either have every single missing link or when people abandon religion, and basically said that the chance of either of those happening are slim to none, so it's not even really worth entertaining the possibility that could ever occur. And really, I mean, there's a lot of truth to that statement, right? Most of the fossil record is gone. Right? We only have roughly about 5% of every species that has ever lived is present in the fossil record. So the likelihood that we will ever find every missing link isn't, I mean, it's next to nil, right? It's not possible. Similarly, even as science expands, people cling to religion, and we're seeing a resurgence of religious fundamentalism not only in the United States, but certainly across the Middle East with the appearance of ISIS and a lot of the conflict that's come up because of that. I mean, we've got an increasing conflict between religion and science. This isn't going away. Similarly, Darwin didn't have much to say on other sources of evolutionary change. Natural selection is all well and good, but it's not the only thing that's going on. Later in the semester, we'll talk about things like sexual selection. Sexual selection, in some contexts, we'll call it the Zahavian handicap principle, has been tied to natural selection. The reason that we find things beautiful is because they're really hard to fake. Only signals that are costly can be accurate indicators kind of what the underlying genetic quality is of the organism possessing it. But there's been a resurgence of late of allowing for sexual selection to be arbitrary, not really as something indicating higher genetic quality, but just some random factor that females thought were beautiful, or in sex role reverse species, males thought were beautiful. So we've got some traits that are the effects of sexual selection that may not have any adaptive function whatsoever. One of the interesting ones, your chin. Our chin seems to be a sexually selected trait. We'll talk about it a little more as we talk about fossil hominins, but it's something that really only appears with the advent of our species. So what made chins sexy? I don't know. You guys can look it up on your own. So sexual selection is one of those other mechanisms, but so is genetic drift. Sometimes what fixes in a population is simply random. Blue eyes and blonde hair in Scandinavia may be one of these, kind of an example of this, that the reason that you've got so many tall blonde Swedes, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Swedes, is not an effect of blonde hair and blue eyes surviving better in that kind of habitat, but rather just because you happen to have a few more blonde-haired, blue-eyed individuals present. So the way that I like to teach genetic drift is, imagine this. We have a bag, and in my bag I have 10 marbles. 5 of them are blue, 5 of them them are red. You're going to pick 2 marbles. That's going to be your breeding pair. We're going to double, actually, you're going to pick 3 marbles. We're going to then double those marbles for the next generation. So let's say you pick 2 blue, 1 red. We double that. Now we've got a population of, oh no, sorry, you have to pick 5 marbles. This illness has really thrown me for a loop. So you've got to pick 5. So you pick 3 blue, 2 red. We double that, okay? Your next breeding population is going to have 6 blue, 4 red. Now I'm going to ask you again, pick 5. You're probably going to pick either 3 blue, 2 red again, or 4 blue, 1 red. So we'll go the 4 blue, 1 red. We double that. Now we've got a breeding population that's 8 blue, 2 red. And I ask you to pick 5. You are much more likely to pick 5 blue marbles. We have already reached fixation in like 3 generations, and it was purely random. There wasn't some adaptive benefit to having red marbles in your bag versus blue marbles. It was just pure chance alone, and particularly with bottlenecks or these founding kinds of populations, which certainly do characterize human evolution. We've had population bottlenecks. We've definitely had founder effects. That makes genetic drift even more likely. All right, so lastly, we will talk a bit about opposition to evolutionary theory. After World War I, we had this resurgence of quote-unquote traditional values. This is really where religion started to come back in vogue in the U.S., that we started to think that women's place was in the home, that good, solid Christian family values, church every Sunday, so on and so forth. In the 1920s, we had the Scopes monkey trial. It was because of a law in Tennessee that forbade the teaching of evolution, and this was part of this traditional values resurgence of religion bit. And so the ACLU supported Scopes for going ahead and being charged with teaching evolution. And it was a very publicized, very highly publicized lawsuit. He ended up paying a $100 fine. Eventually, the conviction was overturned and expunged from his record. But this kind of ushered in this idea that that textbooks don't have to contain science. Textbooks can contain quote-unquote theories or beliefs that are part of religiosity. So throughout like the 1960s, even into modern times, we've had textbooks, particularly at the state level, that have had challenges to evolutionary theory. In the 1960s, we had the emergence of creation science and intelligent design, the idea that sure, change can happen, but only under the influence or kind of under the direction of an intelligent designer, and challenges then to public school curricula that advocate for including creation science in high school biology textbooks. The problem is creationism is not a hypothesis that can be tested. It can't be falsified, right? And that is the danger of applying kind of a religious explanation to science as a whole. In biology, we cling to the idea or the kind of truth that often the most parsimonious explanation, that which involves fewest steps, is the true explanation. We're not going to take a roundabout, meandering way to get there if we can do it directly. Well, nothing is more parsimonious than saying God said so, or because God did it, because God designed it, because God, divinely created us in his own image. So once we start invoking God as an explanation for biology, we really don't have a reason to pursue scientific inquiry, right? It's going to be God's will whether you live or die. It's going to be God's will whether your cancer is healed or not. And so this kind of attack on the very basis of biology threatens scientific inquiry kind of across the board. And there have been some interesting books published kind of in that vein. I had one for a while and gave it to my father-in-law as a birthday present, and then correspondingly forgot the name of it and the author of it. But it was basically saying that with this rise of evangelical Christianity that we've seen in the U.S., that not only is it associated with a decline in belief in evolution, but that it's associated with a decline in scientific performance across the board. I mean, we used to be scientific innovators in the U.S., and now we're not. Now, when Sandia or Los Alamos hire PhDs, they're hiring people from Japan, India, China. They're not hiring people from the U.S. This should worry you, right? This should be problematic. We need to continue to embrace science as important in the U.S. It's the only way that we're going to be competitive in the long run, but also really the only way we're going to save our species, given the degree to which humans are destroying the planet. Anyway, there's my little rant for a moment. So when we talk about current beliefs, the U.S. and Turkey are the lowest, the last two. Turkey's last and U.S. is next to last among developed countries in the belief in evolution and correspondingly belief in science. And so there was a poll that was done by both Gallup and the Pew Research Center that asked specific, I mean, they're loaded questions. If you were to go out and ask most people in the U.S., do things change over time? Just a vague question like that. I don't know that anybody would really argue with you. Yeah, absolutely, things change over time, right? But to believe in or accept or understand the microevolution, right? The way that Staphylococcus aureus develops methicillin resistance, or the way that fruit flies change the number of facets on their eyes, or the way that snapping shrimp just randomly become right or left-handed. I mean, that ties into understanding human origins as well. And so the questions asked were, human beings have developed over millions of years from less advanced forms of life, but God guided the process, God had no part in the process, or God created human beings pretty much in their present form at one time within the last 10,000 years ago. So we have intelligent design as number one. We have evolutionary theory as number two, and we have young earth creationism as number three. We have, over the past 10 years, seen both an increase in those who understand evolutionary theory from about 14% to 19%, but also this kind of stability of belief in creationism, the stability of those who disbelieve really in evolutionary theory at all. And 42% of the adult population in the United States as of 2014 doesn't believe that humans evolved. So, I mean, this knowledge of human evolution influences fields like medicine. If we don't believe in human evolution, we're not going to support things like stem cell research. We're not going to support gene therapies. Now, there certainly absolutely is reason to question some of the ethics behind some of the genetic testing that's going on, but the future of medicine is going to lie in genetically individualized treatment plans, understanding kind of the genome, both of the pathogens that you're affected by, as well as your own personal genome. And we are each individuals when it comes to our genomics. So some of the contributing factors to a poor understanding or to a disbelief, let's say, in humans having evolved is a poor understanding of biology, particularly genetics. I mean, people equate human evolution to a monkey standing up one day and saying, "Whoo, I'm man," right? Or the idea, like in Rise of Planet of the Apes, that we can give a chimpanzee an injection of human DNA and all of a sudden he's going to stand up, want to wear clothes and walk and talk. None of that is true. We didn't evolve from monkeys. We evolved from a common ancestor between monkeys, apes, and humans. We didn't evolve from apes. We evolved from a proto-human, proto-chimpanzee ancestor. And it was a very gradual process, and many of the variants that emerged, many of our sister species became evolutionary dead ends. You know, we're not going to be able to take a chimpanzee and put them on the moon of Jupiter and have them evolve into humans because it was very contextually specific due to very specific environmental features. We're not going to be able to recreate our evolutionary pathway if we go to Mars or something. So there's a lot of misunderstanding tied up in creationism. Science is politicized. Science is a liberal thing, which just blows my mind because science is a human thing, right? But things like evolutionary theory and things like climate change both get tied up in what's viewed as a liberal agenda. We are libtards. We are special snowflakes. Whatever the insults are that are used in political debate. We don't even have a healthy venue for political debate in this country. As soon as somebody disagrees with you, they're wrong and you don't listen to them. And I mean, that persists in a variety of contexts. So we're not getting anywhere in terms of the politicization of science. I mean, it's become increasingly politicized, and evolutionary theory is at the forefront of that because it, quote unquote, destroys family values. There are people out there who purport that if you don't believe in God, you're, I mean, obviously going to hell according to religious ideology, but also that you have no basis for morality. And interestingly, there are evolutionary anthropologists right now who are showing that non-human primates have a basis for morality, and that our humanness and moral compass may go back even farther than our species. So, if you kind of refuse to accept evidence because you associate some political ideology with it, then we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to see compromise. We're not going to broaden your horizons. We're not going to increase our knowledge base, particularly when politics determines science funding. And that's where it's really dangerous, right? I mean, we look at the shutdown right now. We look at the fact that scientific research has been halted, that we are destroying things like national parks, all because of a wall on our southern border, all because of $5 billion. I mean, we have science so wrapped up in politics that I don't know if there's any hope for science anymore, to be quite honest. And that should be incredibly depressing to you. So, yeah, politics and science really should be independent entities. The third is a literal interpretation of the Bible, or if you're in Turkey, literal interpretation of the Quran. One of the things that one of the insights you might gain from taking a general anthropology class like 1101 or even 1130 Cultures of the World is comparative religion. When we look to religion, or we look for evidence of universality of religion or whatever, we do have evidence for universal religiosity, as I already mentioned, right? When we don't have science explanations for things, we look to the supernatural. All humans do it. But modern world religions were all created no sooner than about 5 or 6 thousand years ago, and were written to control people's actions. They were written as an institution to be able to control the larger populations of cities that were relatively anonymous. So, these religious texts that you may base an entire fundamental belief system on were written by men. They're contentious. There are books of the Bible that aren't viewed as books of the Bible that used to be books of the Bible a couple hundred years ago. So, they're constantly under revision. They are not the word of an omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient deity. They are what people wrote down as justifications for things like misogyny, for polygyny, for racial discrimination, etc. So you've got to recognize the historical context of your religious text if you want to use those texts as the basis for an entire fundamental belief system. And John Miller from Michigan State University said American Protestantism is more fundamentalist than any except perhaps Islamic fundamentalism, hence Turkey being the last among developed nations. We'll end with a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson. The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it. So what I will teach you over the course of the semester is the best summary of our scientific knowledge up to this date. Does that mean that I'm going to be right about absolutely everything? No, I could get some things wrong because our current body of knowledge could be wrong. There could be a new fossil find that totally rewrites our evolutionary history, right? But that's the great thing about science. And if we stop scientific inquiry, we're not ever going to find that out, right? If we stop scientific inquiry, we're not closer to the quote unquote truth, really, right? If anything, we're just living in what's the word I'm looking for? When you're blissfully unaware. Ignorance, I guess, is the word I was looking for. I just can't, ignorance is bliss, right? So in summary, have a general understanding of the historical context and development of evolutionary theory, know the importance critically of Charles Lyell and Thomas Malthus in both Darwin and Wallace's ideas, the basic tenets or processes of evolution by natural selection, the evidence that we see, that we gave just three relatively modern examples, ideas of what kind of developments have been made since Darwin's time, specifically Evo Devo. There's a great parody of Despacito done by ASAP Science called Evo Devo. I'll put that link up as an optional reading and resource this week. It's fantastic. And then understand the opposition to evolution and thusly science in the US. And you may find yourself part of a group that is religiously fundamentalist, right? And then you've got to define for yourself with scientific knowledge what is your role. You at least for the scope of this course have to understand what I teach and be able to present that back to me in a variety of assignments. But my hope, if you do define yourself as religious for this course, is that through a better understanding, maybe you can help to facilitate some of the dialogue between science and religion. Because right now, this whole mindset of I don't like what you say, therefore you're wrong, and I'm not listening to you really isn't getting us anywhere.